that green means go forward in the presentation.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want us to keep the badges on so you remember who we are?
Well, if you're in alphabetical order.
That's right. Then I think it'll be okay.
Should we wait a couple of minutes to allow a few more people that can come into the hot room? So let's wait 5 minutes. Good afternoon. There's a reason they gave us these fans, I think. So Yeah. Good afternoon. My name's Tanya Pampalone. I'm the managing editor of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. We're a network of 182 small nonprofit investigative journalism organizations in 77 countries. Our daily work is centered around sharing knowledge around innovation and sustainability, as well as providing resources, tips, and tools about investigative journalism. And it's such an honor always to talk about journalism and where we're headed. It's what's happening in our field globally, how it's changing, and how we can keep up on these massive shifts in our profession. So we're all very excited, this panel here, to be talking with you about innovation in journalism in education sector. So I'd like to start off by telling you how the panelists on the stage today met back in 2017. It was when I first joined GIJN. But before I get there, I just want to give you a little bit of context. I think it's important to understand a bit about my journey. Before that, to put it in context, GIJN was my first foray into media development after years of working as a freelancer in various locations. Most recently, I spent 7 years at South Africa's Mail and Guardian, which was then regarded as the country's premier investigative and political publication. And it was at the M&G, because it was 2007 that I started, and I was there for the next 6.5 years. And as those of you, who were in newsrooms at the time were seeing, and those of us in the education profession were watching, these massive changes were hitting newsrooms around the world at that time. And when people asked me why I left years later, I would tell them that journalism had broken my heart. So and that was really how I felt. I kept, you write these pieces in your mind where you think, journalism broke my heart, so every day I'd get up and talk to myself about how journalism broke my heart. And I was completely depressed about the state of journalism. The Mail and Guardian had departed from its roots, which it started in kind of apartheid South Africa in the 80s. I was watching as older journalists were given payouts, the budget cuts were rolling out, more and more frequently. We were getting hit by them all the time. But in the meanwhile, we were having these like small pockets of excitement. We had a healthy online presence. We developed what was then state-of-the-art tablet version of the Mail and Guardian. We watched snowfall kind of appear on the New York Times and made our own HTML5 story. We developed apps by copying what NPR was doing, and we had a massive social media presence. But as our revenues dropped, the projects dropped, and what survived was a drive for clicks and our increasingly popular social media. So I left the Mail and Guardian and tried out teaching. I did a lot of nonfiction book editing and basically wallowed in my sadness and my broken heart at the end of journalism. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, like many of my colleagues. But that was when I noticed something started to shift. My former colleague went on, like so many journalism colleagues, to an international nonprofit in New York. My colleagues who ran the investigative unit at the Mail and Guardian broke off to become the nonprofit Amamungani Center for Investigative Journalism. Another friend and colleague from the Mail and Guardian started up Becky Sisa, a nonprofit health journalism center, and I joined another friend and colleague in the early stages of Media Hack. What was then the idea of a collaborative center is now working on a for-profit data journalism group, which has gone on to win multiple local and global awards. So I tell you these stories because it's a reflection of what is happening in our industry. And this is just in my tiny ecosystem in South Africa. But there's a massive shift, as we know, in many fronts, in revenue models, in reach, in teaching approaches, in the kind of overwhelming state of technology, and even how we talk about the future of our profession. But I'll get back to 2017. When I started at GIJN, that's when Dave Kaplan, our executive director, sent me to Tbilisi. Oops, that's not it. So in Tbilisi, a small group of us gathered to talk about innovation, sharing knowledge about innovation. And they were from the International Center for Journalists, journalism.co.uk, the Neiman Lab, Maharat Foundation, the Media Development Investment Fund, the European Journalism Observatory, the Splice Newsroom, JAM Lab Africa, and Central European University's Center for Media, Data, and Democracy. So we were a team together, and we did a lot of talking and PowerPoints, and we spent our days in beautiful Tbilisi talking about innovation and collaboration and how we could get better at collaboration. And it was really exciting. I met kindred spirits, and they were excited among the chaos and confusion of our profession and determined we would make a difference. And we talked about so many things as we do at conferences, and we were going to conquer the world. It was a call to arms, and we were going to save journalism, as conferences go. I wanted to, we created this lovely the media innovation library on paper, and I was going to work there. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, So, as the excitement goes, we came up with a wish list in Tbilisi before leaving. So our wish list included, sharing others' content and good practices around innovation, data sets that sorted by language and location, including journalism jobs, training, workshops, grants, and fellowships, templates for analytics, knowledge toolkits, networks, a Slack channel where we could communicate. But this is the kicker, so that we were slackers on Slack. So beyond those face-to-face crucial meetings, only our Slack group survived. So, and that just barely with content sharing and translations, something that kind of did survive. So the question is how do we sustain knowledge sharing networks like this one, around innovation? And so with no further ado, let me introduce my fellow slackers. So this is these are my fellow slackers on the panel. There's also one I can see in the audience, Rosenthal, thank you. He was also slacking in Tbilisi with us. I'm going to just now allow Marius, Indra, and Alan to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what briefly about their journey and what they do in innovation sharing.
Is this working? Okay, great. We promised to go in alphabetical order so that no one gets confused. Hi, everybody. I'm not sure if I had the opportunity to meet many of you here at this conference. My name is Alan Soon. I co-founded Splice Media about 4 years ago as a way to help champion the work of media startups in Asia. Our kind of premise was that Asia needed a voice and a platform for some of these media startups to shine. The work that we've done in Splice has been around transforming newsrooms, supporting the training and the workshops that go into the processes of transformation in newsrooms across Asia. So it's something that's very close to my heart. I've been in journalism for about, I guess, two decades before jumping off to build my own thing. I started out in radio, I did TV, I did newswires, magazines. My last kind of corporate newsroom job was running Yahoo's media business in Southeast Asia and India. So that lasted for about 6 years until the company lost interest in the region because the ROI just wasn't quite there. And that's when I started Splice, because I felt that newsrooms across Asia really needed a way to jump forward into where media was going. I wanted to take all the lessons that I've learned about building audiences, building products, and taking them to other newsrooms as well. So that's been our core mission at Splice. We believe that it's almost easier to go and launch a bunch of media startups than it is to try to turn around one old legacy newsroom. So, the work that we're trying to do includes case studies, includes consulting work, it includes an event that we just did 2 months ago. So that's what we do in a snapshot. I'm just going to hand this over now.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Indra Delanarol. I run a program called JAM Lab, Journalism and Media Lab in Johannesburg, South Africa. we're kind of a less grown-up version of Splice. We started about 2.5 years ago. My background and interest in this question of knowledge sharing around innovation is, I didn't study journalism, I studied AI a long time ago, when it was more of an idea than a practice. So I studied artificial intelligence, and then I got trained in journalism at BBC. I worked there for around a decade, and then I ran various media businesses, which did some journalism, but mostly had to survive doing a much broader range of media, first in the UK and then in South Africa, which is where my family is from. And I also, some 10 years ago, started doing some teaching in the journalism department at the biggest university in Johannesburg. And the same thing Tanya noticed, which is I guess from the 2000s, what was interesting in Africa with the digital revolution is it happened first on the phone. And so in the 2000s, we started making content for the phone, initially for very, very few people, and slowly that grew and grew. And then suddenly, for the first time on the continent, everyone had a phone. Until then, phone penetration in Africa had remained at about 1% to 2% for 50 years. And it went in a decade, pretty much went to where it is now, somewhere between, across the continent, between 65 and 100%. So this transformation was really a revolution about how people get information. And like Alan, and different maybe to Tanya, is people, especially people who worked in newspapers, digital was a sort of sad story of destruction. So if that's where you'd been working, that's how you experienced digital, in my experience. I came from broadcasting, and actually that wasn't as badly affected. But also, I loved playing with the toys, so I thought it was quite exciting. And especially in an African context, it was exciting because it was so obvious that things like newspapers had completely failed to engage the vast majority of audience. If you go to most African capitals and look at the newspapers, drive 2 hours in any direction, those newspapers don't get there. So I was really, really excited about the possibilities. But then I think, like Alan, learned that possibilities are one thing, practice is another, and especially the practice around sustainability. So how do you actually make something where people can still do reporting, where people aren't just going to copy free stuff already from existing sources. If they can do that, they need resources. If they need resources, they need operating or business models that are viable. And so we started our lab 3 years ago. We take on teams, sometimes in existing media organizations, sometimes brand new startups, and help them create new media products or services. And that to me is doing or supporting innovation as a practice. And I think it's a really interesting thing listening to the various discussions around new technologies and innovation and entrepreneurship in the conference. I think it's a really interesting question for educators, is how do you link the practices and the change outside, how do you link that back to students and the classroom? And hopefully we can discuss that today. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Great to be here as well. My name is Marius Dragomir, and I am the director of an institution called the Center for Media, Data and Society. The center has been in business for 15 years now, and we belong to a Central European University, which is a private educational establishment in Budapest, Hungary. It was founded more than 25 years ago by the philanthropist and investor George Soros. But some of you might know that because of the continuous attacks of the Hungarian government, we are obliged to move to Vienna as of this autumn, which is quite disruptive for us. So my background, I started as a journalist in the 1990s, covering a lot of issues, political issues, social issues, business in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism in 1989. Then I moved into media development. I was working for the Open Society Foundations for a while, where I was doing both grant making but also research into the media. And now I'm actually running a center that is whose main mission is to do research into the state of independent media and journalism in the world. We do operate globally because of the mission of the university. We had in the just finished academic year students from over 120 countries. In our work specifically, we cover any country outside the US and Western Europe, and basically we are going to places that are under research, where there is no information and research into the state of the media. In terms of how we share our information, well, first of all, by nature we have to share. This is our mission, to actually produce research and make sure that we share that knowledge with as many people as possible and as many interested parties as possible. But the mission is one thing, the way we do it is another thing, which is, I think, what we are going to discuss here. We are far from perfect. We are reaching out to mostly the people in our networks and mostly researchers and increasingly journalists. So how we do it, it's by using the usual channels, but what we have been trying in the past 2 years to improve our outreach is to actually do more journalism. So as we speak, we have an investigative journalism, I don't know how to call it, initiative, because it's not a unit, it's just a number of journalists in our office working on these issues. And the idea there is to pair students interested in doing journalism with media outlets and to produce investigations. And I'm mentioning that in this context of knowledge sharing because I think this is a way for us to actually share more of the complex, sometimes very boring research that we are doing by writing more journalistically, picking up some of the issues from the reports that we are doing and trying to reach out first to the more general public, but at the same time to people who actually are in the field and use this kind of information.
That's really exciting. I'm wondering, like, we all are kind of involved in different initiatives, and I think that that's really important about what's happening. So what I'm interested in asking you, and I can start with you again, Alan, is what knowledge kind of needs to be shared? Yeah. So what is it that we need to share and talk about more?
I think business models comes up a lot. I think, every single media organization out there is trying to figure out exactly how to build new streams of revenue. And I think that there's a real need for all of us to do a better job at explaining what's going on out there, talking about the journalists who are building new and innovative newsrooms. We need to talk a little bit more about their products and services that they're bringing to market, and talk about how this needs to be the new thinking behind journalism today. I think we need to share these stories so that we know that there's a path forward that exists, right? It's easy for us to assume that just because of all the narrative that's going on with media, that media is dying. And we actually take the opposite view. We believe that media is in a golden age right now, just because of all the possibilities that are out there in terms of what you can do and build and create, often for little or no cost, right? As a way to experiment and take that first step into that space. So, we want to see more sharing in terms of knowledge around what is getting built, how are they getting built, and to turn these into useful case studies that other entrepreneurs can take and move forward.
Yeah, I love that, and you guys do that really well at Splice, sharing kind of like what's going on in terms of building up the startups in Asia. I mean, Indra, you're doing, you're actually helping accelerate these startups. I mean, is that, what knowledge needs to be shared? Is that, yeah?
I mean, following Alan, I, absolutely agree with business models being central. The second thing is actually audiences. A third thing is, which relates to that idea of case studies of who's doing what, is I use a phrase which is borrowed from a famous software developer, coder from the 70s, who talked about reinventing the flat tire. I think in innovation, not just in journalism and media, but across the board, in public interest innovation, which is the sort of broader field we see ourselves as working in, we just find a lot of people going, oh, look, this tech, this could do something, why don't I try and do it? The two questions they're not asking often, and they may invest a lot of effort and indeed resources, the one question they're not asking is, has someone done this before, and what was their experience, and could I learn from it? And the second question that they're often not asking is, who needs this, who wants it, and what do we know about their need or their want, or what a software developer would call a use case? So those are probably the biggest things we help with. And I think I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of the conference, because the way I understand what we do, and a concern I would have about journalism education is, I think journalism education grew up at a time when the ground we stood on in relation to these issues, the business of media, the distribution systems of media, and the audiences of media were relatively stable. So we could take them as givens, and then we could teach from there. And we're obviously in an age where on all those counts, it's completely unstable. And therefore, I think, you know, I know a lot of journalism educators get very nervous when we're talking about business models or things that don't sound like they belong in the realm of journalism, and especially in the context of the Chinese walls in media. However, if you understand that this is very unstable ground, and I think students understand this too, by the way, because their practices are part of this new complexity, then it is an onus to try and bring back into the classroom, how do you investigate that ground? And then we can take our ideas about our storytelling or our ethics and apply it, but in that context. And that requires finding stuff out. I mean, our classroom in the lab it's not teaching, it's coaching people to go out and find stuff out. That's really the only thing we make them do.
That's amazing. I mean, and from Marius, from your side, you work in kind of, your work's slightly different. Can you talk to, like, you know what it is that we need to be sharing about?
Sure.
From your perspective?
Yeah, as I was saying, we have the usual approach of research, academic / journalism center, where we produce a lot of reports, and then we follow up with the networks that we have in various parts of the world. We have our own people doing social media and communication and so on. We finish this panel, I'll bombard you with emails, you know, the very chaotic way of reaching out to people. But recently we realized that, we have to be a bit more disciplined with how we communicate and how we share information, because I think looking at what we see out there, I think there is a lot of information, first of all, that many people don't need. Actually, even ourselves, sometimes I'm looking and I'm reading things and I'm wondering, wow, I don't actually need to read all this stuff. So this is one thing that I notice. I think there is an overflow of information and knowledge sharing, and it's not what I think we need is more a more targeted approach. And this is something that we are trying. We are far from being perfect, but what we have tried to do was to think better in terms of the audiences of this information and the way we share it. And in fact, that's actually impact, I think. So what we are doing is every year we are trying to understand, using some of our partners and the surveys that they are doing among their members, what actually people need to know about. And if it's something that we are able to provide, if we have, let's say, a study on business models, because it's such an important topic, we know that this is something that we have to share more at that period in time. And in fact, this is actually good, because what's the second step that we are trying to do, and of course you need time, you need resources to do that, to have that approach, is to follow up with some of the people in these networks who expressed need for such information and see what they do with that information. Because at the end of the day, I really believe that it's important to actually understand what people do in practice with that. And the results are mixed. It really sometimes, usually people in the practitioners, they usually, if they need that information, they will use it or not. So you know immediately if the kind of data or research that you are sharing is useful, because they will not engage or will engage with that. And I think this is a very good approach. We are just testing that with mixed results, but I think is the way to go. The problem, again, at the end of the day, you need a lot of resources to be able to actually follow up on each constituency and each group to see actually what do people do with the knowledge that you are sharing with them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing that we talked about a lot in Tbilisi was, we're duplicating our efforts. And I think it's, I mean, this is kind of like the nature of things moving so quickly, but we are duplicating our efforts. We aren't collaborating enough. So I'm wondering, what gaps do you see in our knowledge sharing? I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff we don't see, but yeah, where are the gaps?
Well, very quickly, I can say there are lots of gaps, but what is important to realize is that things are changing very fast. So we cannot say there is a big gap in research on AI in journalism. Maybe there is, I don't know. But because these things are changing, so, and especially as being in the field, I think we have to really, focus and research the field to actually see where the priorities are moving. This is what is, I think, is quite important, an important thing that we notice in our work.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Another example, I think, is just regional gaps. So if you want to track what's happening in terms of innovation, whether it's technological innovation or business model innovation about North America, there's lots of information. If you're doing it about Western Europe, there's lots of information. If you're doing it on Asia or even more so in Africa, then we're having to often, in our case, generate that information ourselves. And that's really, it's not only time consuming, it's actually really hard to do. It's really hard to build the networks to really do that well. Alan and I were speaking about, like, for example, you can get a journalist in Kenya, you found a story, you get them to write about it, but they don't really understand the background of the innovation field or the media practices. So actually it takes quite a long time to get them up to speed to do that. It's a slow process. So there's a really uneven distribution of information. And I think there's a deeply incorrect assumption that doesn't matter so much because what happens first in the most developed markets will slowly happen everywhere else, but actually we know that isn't how it works.
Yeah, Alan, can you speak a bit about that, kind of that dominance and what you're trying to do with Splice? I remember when when we first met, you described it like we want to be the Neiman Lab of Asia, which I actually think you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's the elevator pitch. We feel strongly that a lot of the narrative that goes on in this space around media tends to be an American one, right? Just because you have Neiman Lab, which does an amazing job covering the American media landscape. You also have Pointer. You also have API. There are all these great efforts that are ongoing in the U.S. and about explaining what's going on in media, but you don't really have that anywhere else. Obviously, in Europe, you have some, fragment of that through EJC, for example, or journalism.co.uk. But I think it's really important that we take the view that every region will grow at a different speed. It may grow in a very different direction, depending on the circumstances of that market. And so, when we put Splice together, we wanted to make sure that we could come up with case studies that were unique to what was going on in Asia. The demographics are different. The social change is different, and we need to take a bigger view on that one. One of my biggest frustrations has been around a lot of the language that's been thrown about in the past decade or so. Everything from pivot to video, which was a Facebook-led effort to throw people over the cliff, and then it was memberships, and then it was subscriptions, and then at every turn I think as an industry we're always looking for silver bullets, right? We're always looking for something to clutch and to hold on to, thinking that this is going to save journalism. And the problem is that a lot of these are very American in their narratives.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I'm watching Marius nod his head, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking over there. I mean, I know we in agreement. I work in Johannesburg, and we also this is what we talk about a lot: is how different. We need to share the knowledge that's coming out of developing markets. I think Night Center does a fantastic job of sharing that the innovation that's happening in Latin America. Yeah, and Can you speak to this a little bit?
Well, I totally agree with that, and I was going to make exactly both points. The fact that everybody expects anything happening in Western Europe or in US to then be replicated in other parts of the world, no, it's wrong. It doesn't happen at all anymore. The second thing is that I totally agree with the fact that regions develop at a totally different speed. And I think that's even, actually this is an important point, because if you talk about knowledge sharing, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. What you are going to share with whom and at what points in time and why. For me, really important is why would people need that information, how would they use it? Just going back to my first point. One thing that I want to mention, which is not always in our attention as journalists or people or researchers covering journalism and independent media, is the fact that there are many things happening in the policy area that we are not paying too much attention to. And because we work increasingly, we work a lot with policymakers and researchers, and now we work a lot with journalists, we see that the attention of course, in the policymaking area is much higher, but in the journalism field, people don't really pay attention to things, for example, like the closing space in various countries because of the takeover of the internet by governments, simply by adopting legislation, policies, and so on. And this is something really, really important, and I think one important trend that we should pay attention to is factors that influence independent media and journalism other than the industry-led or grown ones. And policy was just an example. There are many, many other things happening.
That's really interesting. There was one thing, like, that you had touched upon that we were speaking with Indra about this, is like, why we're slackers, why we failed, and I'm very, very interested in this, kind of our exuberance, and then kind of it fails, and you did speak about that, and I wondered if you could articulate like how you put that together, just in terms of, how can we create sustainable collaboration? I mean, you talked about a transactional.
Yeah, we were talking about, because I wasn't actually at Tbilisi, my colleague Seppo was there, and so we were talking about this fact that, and I mean, I've heard it today in this morning's syndicate report backs. In the gender one, for example, the rapporteur was saying, and we definitely thought we must all create a portal or something to share best practice, and I've been at many, many conferences and gatherings where people get excited about this, like, oh, that really interesting stuff, but, sustaining knowledge networks, well, it's sustaining networks, full stop, but including knowledge-sharing networks always turns out to be much harder than people hope or think, and I think it's a sort of structural thing about networks. I mean, networks are, if they're not used every day, then they slowly fade away, a bit like social networks in your life, like friends you don't call. And so you have to then ask, what's the reason that you would check in every day? Or whatever it is, once a week, or what's the continuing reason to use it? And I think it's almost always about, does it really fit within my practice? And I think when we look at this innovation stuff and think, well, how does that fit in journalism education? What I would really call for, and it came up in the syndicate I was involved in around journalism entrepreneurship, but I think it's much deeper and more general than that. It's not just about the business of media. It's, to pick up on Marius's point, I think students who are thinking of entering this thing we call a profession have to be citizens now of that profession. In other words, they can't just assume that the mechanics of this profession, the political economy of this profession, the relationships that sustain it, the regulatory framework, the actors of the platform actors who can pull the rug out from the business models of the profession. We need to be bringing students into the world who actually have an understanding of that, understand its fragility, including, and take some responsibility to having a voice in shaping it, because it's an absolutely unstable thing. And I'd say the other big issue for me is this include the learning about the audience, learning about the operational models behind journalism. That I think a student should know that by the time they've done a degree or a postgraduate thing. They should have an understanding of, and they should not know as in the answers. And I think it was Robert from USC, when there was a discussion about new technologies on one of the other panels, and someone asked, like, so how did you actually teach this new technology? He said, no, I just told them to go and Google it. Yeah, I'm talking about giving students the experience of finding stuff out. We don't have to have answers. They're not going to have definitive answers, whether it's AI. These things are far too fluid. But they've got to actually learn about finding this stuff out. And I'm going on a bit, but my last point about that is most of the stuff I heard in the last couple of days about innovation was focused on innovation in, we could call the production side, the storytelling, etc. And I would urge that we need to include the distribution side, the stuff that used to be, what you could call the publisher's job rather than the journalist's job. Because, that's the part that's really changing fast. And innovation can be good or bad, but it's innovating. There's nothing stable about that, and I don't think any journalist can really afford to find a place in the world if they have no understanding how that works and can at least monitor the changes that are taking place.
But I mean, like everybody else in society, I find that we are inundated with changes in the technology field, and like I feel sometimes like we're failing in our ability to curate properly. But I don't know how you curate properly when there's all this information coming at us. Yeah, I wonder, like, is there a solution to that? Like that kind of like knowledge sharing overload? What is there too much, and we're just like covering everything? I mean, I find we have an aggregation channel at GIJN where all the editors kind of put together things that are happening in their region, and then we try and share it, and we're sharing. And is that helpful? Or that comes back to the question is, what does the audience do with the information we give them? Got a question?
Since I'm the one with the microphone here. I agree. I think there's too much going on out there, and it's very hard to make sense of it all, right? And this is one of the reasons why we started writing a newsletter ourselves. And the newsletter that we have now is something that we started a long time ago when we started Splice. And the intent there was to create a weekly update to send to our clients so that they were informed of what was going on in the space. They could see what the trends were, what the transformations were that were going on, the tools that are available to them. And over time, that's become a thing that people seem to continue to subscribe to, which is great. And we're looking for as many ways as possible to simplify some of this stuff, right? I think what we do need is better curation of stories and narratives and different approaches. So that we have different ways of communicating some of these ideas, right? The best ideas are the ones that are curated by someone that you trust. So, we want to see more of that. Yeah.
How do we do that? Less is more. I mean, it's kind of like what we're suffering from in journalism. It's like we're putting out too much, and we're not. In journalism, in the media, we're getting too much information, and it's almost like, okay, so you want to direct your attention towards something. How do we help direct attention so we can like optimize knowledge sharing?
I mean, I have no quick answers to this. I mean, it's obvious this is a general media problem, in fact, isn't it, for all media now? I mean, one thing I do notice is we're often confronted with the fact that actually we do, like Alan, we put a lot of stuff in a newsletter. I'm constantly struck by the fact that when you're engaging with people who are working on some innovation or the other, or trying to take account of it, what they actually want is just-in-time information. So the fact you put it in newsletter number 85, when they didn't care about it, they care about it 3 months later when they're confronted with a problem. So, the combining of push and pull and thinking of the information you've got in a more like a librarian than a newspaper, I think is often probably useful.
that kind of evergreen content approach and bringing stuff back. I mean, that's something that does work. We know that works. At GIGN, something that's worked for us is we've increased our production of content. I wish we could slow down, actually, but also the translations are so important to me to be able to. We have Russian and French and Spanish and Bangla. I mean, our Bangla feed is out of control because the information does not, it's just off the hook. It's because the information doesn't exist. And so we're trying to now take stories out of Bangladesh and be able to kind of like tell those. So it's like kind of a reverse push and pull. So for us, like, aggregation works too much, I think. But translations have worked for us in terms of helping us share the knowledge. Is there something that you're seeing that's assisted you in kind of knowledge sharing and spreading that?
Well, first of all, I'm not so worried about us. I think we are, the answer to the way we share the knowledge we produce, I think, is quite simple. I think we should simply communicate better and especially not to duplicate work, not to do the same report in the same country or on the same topic, 4 of us. But there is no, in my opinion, there is no perfect recipe for how we can perfectly share the knowledge among ourselves and our partners. And in fact, at the end of the day, I'm not really worried about that. I think the key area where we can actually have more impact and reach out to more people would be to work on audiences, because our audiences are different, I guess. In some areas they overlap, which is great, because I guess some of the the people who consume Splice's content might read some of our reports from Asia or some of your reports from Asia. So I think if we try to share more of the interests and the profiles of the audiences, I think that would be a great thing. And this is something, I'm saying that because we see that that's a positive thing. We are experimenting with that at a very low level. We don't have time to analyze all 5,000 people that follow us on various networks, but we go one by one and try to see who these people are and how well we know them, and the results are quite interesting. And we have to find a way to properly address that, because we cannot analyze each person in our networks. But I think cooperating and exchanging knowledge about the audiences, I think, would be a great thing for us, if you are open to that, of course.
Yeah, and I think that, is there anything that's particularly worked for you two, just in your organizations, just in terms of, for us, it's translations and, writing how-to case studies. Is there something that's really worked well for you?
I mean, the best sharing we've done is definitely event-based. So,
Face-to-face.
Face-to-face, same space. So every year we hold, for example, this isn't journalists, but it's still digital media. We hold an event for people in the public sector and civil society organizations who are using digital media. And one of the most sort of things that excites people the most is simply a kind of World Cafe style session where there's screens, there's someone who worked on the project. You get 20 minutes with that person to ask them questions about what they did, why it worked, what didn't work. And, they spend maybe half a day or a third of a day on that, and they feel like that's a snapshot of what's going on. And I would add, so I think when we talk about knowledge, when you're going down some new road, and it came up in one of the sessions when people were talking about learning some new technologies, there's the information and there's the people. What you really want is a sort of an interlocutor, a coach, or someone who could answer your questions. So, and obviously that's much easier if it's face-to-face. But it's not impossible to do online, and we see that lots of examples of that working too.
And Alan, on your side, I mean, you guys share a lot of case studies. Is there something else that's really working well for you?
Yeah, we try to take a user-centric approach to this kind of stuff, and basically ask, if our goal is to serve the media startup community, what is it exactly that they want, and how can they benefit from a lot of this stuff. What we've also seen is that doing events really does help, because you're really bringing together a network, right? And if you were a media startup, the few things that you would need would be access to funding, for example, access to consultants, access to training, access to fresh talent, access to design thinking, for example, right? So what we try to do is to approach it from that point of view and to ask, what is it that our constituency wants from us, and how do we provide that?
I think it's interesting that also, just to kind of segue to the media education. I mean, Indra and Marius, you're both centered at universities. At GIJN, I try and source different things that are happening at different universities. I look at academic reports. It's hard for me to just have a Google alerts thing that I just try and scan what's going to work. Can I do an excerpt? Can we do a summary of findings? Can something that's of interest to our particular audience. I wonder, are there ways? I mean, I feel like it's kind of haphazard. Someone sends us something, What are the ways that both practitioners and kind of knowledge sharers outside the academy can do better in sharing back and forth with educators and academia?
I'm just developing and thinking about that thought about the networks that Alan's talking about. I mean, I'll give you a case from our lab. So one team, and why this stuff about the operating models and stuff is so important. So we had a team, it was a group of community newspaper publishers in a particular part of South Africa who had come together. They're all publishing small newspapers, around 5,000-10,000 copies a week each. So they come together, and their big idea is they're going to build a website that will then cover more of the province, because they're in different parts of this province. So if they collaborate on this website, then they'll have this website which will attract audience, which will make them money. They thought that they could make more money out of advertising online than they could through their newspapers. So what do they need? I mean, I told them sort of first day, I say, you do know that's not going to work, because actually there's less money in digital advertising than there is in print advertising. And actually the other problem is the only people really you can go to for this digital advertising are exactly the same people that you're already captured in print. That was okay. What was better was putting them in touch with someone like them who had already done this in another part of the country. And I think if you think of most journalism schools, I think have some kind of industry relationships that they use in different ways, for internships, for bringing people to talk and things like that. But I think reaching out to this journalistic media innovation community that Alan's talking about, I think in most of us, there are those startups around. There are people struggling with all these innovation questions in the area where you are. Bring those people in to interact with students, then those questions will get answered. It doesn't have to be a database or a repository or a newsletter.
I really like what you're saying. I mean, and also because I know very intimately what you're working on in South Africa, and I think it's doing amazing work. And Marius,
well, all these, absolutely. And one more thing, I think, is to be as a research center, as an academic institution, that we represent more proactive in our work with people who fund or support in any ways media outlets. And this is something that we didn't discover. In fact, it just happened and that the media development agency hired us to do a report about paywalls at some point. And the reason was because they surveyed at the time their grantees and the media outlets that they supported, and they said this is one of the topics that 80% of them are interested in. Do you have a researcher and an expert able to write 10 pages on paywalls? How to implement a paywall, where to shop for software, all those things. We did it, and that's actually when we started to realize that that's actually impact, because these people will use your paper in practice. They will go to the websites that you recommend.
Crowdsourcing, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's when we realized that this is a way to engage, which is very practical, and it will have at the end of the day impact. But of course, you cannot wait for people come to you. You have to engage with funders, donors, philanthropists that support journalism, which is something that we are doing. We are communicating, talking to them, and when it's possible, we try to get from them as first-hand information about what the people they fund need at the certain period in time. And I think that's also important. And the second thing, by doing this kind of work, we have also increasingly engaged with the investors. Although, you know, there are not so many in the media field these days. But this is a group that we didn't expect. And in fact, this kind of due diligence that we did for various philanthropies was sometimes sought by investors, which was great, because they are the people who are actually funding real outlets, and investors also pay better.
Yeah, I mean, I get all excited talking about all these things. I mean, do you guys have? I want to just talk to the audience a little bit about how they think that, you know, like, you know, our brilliant ideas that we had in Tbilisi that we didn't execute on. I mean, I wonder if we can get the audience involved a little bit. I wanted to just, I was going to put up our little hashtag. One thing that we wanted to ask everyone to do as in an effort in innovation and knowledge sharing is to, I'll put up the hashtag. We wanted to ask if everyone can give some resources that they use, and maybe put it on Twitter and use this hashtag, so we can track it, and then we can share that like almost as a thread. I mean, between the four of us, we were talking about how, you know, what resources do we use as knowledge sharers? Like, where do I go every day? I mean, I'm inundated with newsletters, and I was supposed to think of my top ones, and like I guess I do the easy ones. So I'll let you guys maybe say what you do, and we can then, we'll put it on Twitter, and if anyone in the audience can share where you get your information about innovation in journalism, it would help. I know it would help me, because that's what I do all day. It's my full-time job, is to just see what innovations are happening in journalism, so I am constantly scanning for everything. Alan, do you have some favorites ones that you want to Splice, of course?
No, not Splice.
Splice is one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I have the easy ones, right? So I've got, Neiman Lab, for sure. I read that every day. I read DigiDay to understand what's going on in the marketing, advertising, tech space, because that crossover is huge, and the overlap is huge. I also read The Verge a lot, just to see where some of the tech trends are going from a consumer standpoint. The Verge is also very good at covering some of the policy stuff that you were talking about. And increasingly, this has become such an important space for us to try to understand. We can't interrogate policy changes and policymakers if we don't understand these things as journalists. So that's critical for me. So The Verge gives me an insight into what's going on in that space. I also read The Information, which helps me understand what's going on in terms of Silicon Valley startups. I listen to Tech Meme Ride Home every morning as part of my daily routine. It's a podcast that drops from the Valley. Which also gives me a very good update about what's going on at the intersection of tech and policy and media. So that's good. And then I read some of the regional stuff, like TechNote is very helpful to understand what's going on in China in terms of the tech scene. Okay. So I do bits of that. I read the South China Morning Post for its for the same points of view around tech and business in relation to China.
Right.
Yeah. So there's quite a few.
Yeah, no, it's nice. I mean, I think that
takes the entire day.
Yeah, it does take the entire day. I know. I want to I'm trying to delete some of mine. But Indra, I can't.
So to add to Anne's list, well, EJO and Reuters Institute, I think I try and I've on your original point about curating and getting swamped, I've cut down the extent to which I read daily stuff. I mean, especially in tech, it's sort of unlimited if you go to the global north. So I tend to focus more on long form sort of pieces that are looking a little bit longer term. So I think some of those reports are really useful. On data for Africa, like actually understanding who's connected, how they're connected, what they're doing. Then anything by Research ICT Africa or by us, I'd say is sort of reliable sources. Then I'm really interested in, the discussions about form. So the discussions, and some of the actual general magazines, I think, are writing about this well, around journalism and technologies. New Yorker writes some really good pieces on that. And Wired sometimes has been writing some good coverage over the last couple of years. Because I sort of feel like, you can get lost in the weeds of this. What people need is to think, for the world they're in and the journalists they're training, what are the relevant themes to get students and others to think about.
Yeah, not much to add. I think EJO, nobody mentioned it. That's one of the Reuters platforms that covers journalism in Europe. And also we are lucky to have a network of researchers in various countries, and what we like to gather from them on a regular basis is some of the content from the local media covering media, and these are specific for countries. Like there is a magazine called Marketing and Media in the Czech Republic, one in Slovakia. Almost every country has that kind of resource, or a blogger writing only about these issues. So wherever we are present, and when people in our network have time, they churn out for us some of the information coming from these sources. And sometimes, again, if we have time, that's why I was saying that we are very chaotically approaching that. When we have time, we try to translate that in English and put it on the website and share, make it public.
Yeah, I mean, my secret weapon is like I go through Medium obsessively to try and search it for topics. That's like, because yeah, that's a good secret weapon. I also love, Night Center I read all the time, and yeah, and I also, oh God, what was I gonna do? Oh, Story Bench. Northwestern University is doing such great, like, they're having their students report on, what's going on in the sector, and so it helps them understand what's going on, and then explains it to the rest of us, which I love because that's really collaborative. So I don't know. I'd like to just put this out to the floor. It's and I don't know if Let's see how long we can stand. I hope everyone has a fan going. But if anybody has any innovation, please tweet this or tell us. And can we also does anybody have any questions or anything that they'd like to bring up? Do we have someone with the mic, or must I? I'll go. Me. I'm me. Yeah, I'm good. I'm like, what's the girl on Wheel of Fortune? Not as fast as her. She's very quick.
Okay, this wasn't the session I thought it was going to be, but I really liked it. And, it wasn't yet. Especially because I'm an interdisciplinary researcher, not just in not just reading journalists, talking about journalists. Education is my main focus, but information and knowledge management is part of that. And I'm a community broadcaster, so as a journalist, I talk to different people. One of the people I talked to a while back is a guy called Mike Dixon. He was a scientist. He was pissed off that New Zealand wasn't really covered by Wikipedia. And it's not. New Zealand's a very small country, 4 million people, and its number of Wikipedia entries was pathetic. So what do I need to do to become a Wikipedia editor? In a year and a half, 2 years, he has totally 400, 500%. He goes workshops. He's now a Wikipedia editor at large. They actually pay him to go and teach people to be Wikipedia editors. And while you're talking, and I know about infrastructure, I know about how important infrastructure is, I was thinking, has anybody considered the Wikipedia model? Because it self-regulates. It's not, yes, people do stuff and make messes, but it corrects itself amazingly quickly. And it's open. Guys, I don't have the amount of time you've got. I'm not going to spend that time, and nobody's paying me to do it. But I do the just-in-time researching, and I Google, and I go to Wikipedia, and all of the sources that you mentioned, well, not all, but some of them, I'm familiar with them. But, You talked crowdsourcing. What about librarians? 2 or 3 months ago, I interviewed someone in the school librarians. They're really concerned about digital information literacy. They've got more time than us. They're trained to be curators. You know, maybe journalists need to get outside their journalist box. It seemed to me. Okay. So, I mean, have you considered the Wikipedia model? That's my question.
Thanks. Does anyone want to answer?
Very quickly, when I was working for the Open Society Foundation some years ago, we had a big research project, and at some point we were thinking about a way to update that kind of information, and we started a wiki-like project. It died immediately, but I don't know the reason. I think we underestimated the resources needed to make it work at the beginning, or simply I think we were not actually prepared to do that. So I tried that, it didn't work, but I'm very open to ideas to make it work.
I completely love that idea. I think it's a pretty partial solution. Like, Wikipedia is good for, you know, some anchoring articles that would live there for some time, but it's a fantastic way of crowdsourcing conversations like this into one place. It's a brilliant idea. I really like it. I mean, at an African level, we have, you know, you think New Zealand's got problems. There's a colleague I've worked with before at Oxford who's done some brilliant maps. You can look them up. I'm trying to remember what he calls them, internet geography, I think. He's done some brilliant maps of comparing kind of populations to articles in different parts of the world, so Africa's by far the worst. But not only that, most of the articles about Africa have been written by people from outside Africa. But great idea. On the interdisciplinary point, I completely agree with you. I mean, I mostly don't look for research about journalism from journalists. I'm much more interested in the research about, for example, if we're going to understand audiences, which I was talking about, you know, I look at research from the community of internet research studies, which is really, you know, probably we could say sociologists, people like that, looking at less the technology as in the social uses of the technology. I think STS, Science and Technology Studies, do fantastic work about giving people a framework to understand how to talk about technology in a social sense. You know, not reifying it, not assuming that we're being determinist about it, but giving it its true social place, which I think all of us are experiencing, but then a lot of people get very resistant to really including in a social perspective. So I think, yes, completely agree with you. That's an exciting thing for journalists, people working in journalism to look at.
Thanks, Indra. Alan, I don't know if you've got anything to add. I was just going to go and maybe get people to ask questions, and then we can respond. If you have something you'd like to add.
What I want to say goes into the same direction. I am one of these people who uses what you do, so thank you very much. It's very helpful. Even though I work in a completely different market, which is not a market because it's local journalism and there is no market for this. So what I do, I always read everything I can find, and then I have to translate it. And so my idea was, if I translate it, there's certain kind of criteria or trigger I use, because I say this is possible, this is not. So my idea is, can we add to what you do some sort of like metadata where I can already find somehow, I can search for certain applicable examples, so that we say every innovative newsletter uses the same kind of criteria, description, and this would make my life much more easier. Thank you. Even more easy. Thank you.
I think that was on our wish list. Should we take another question? Should we take the questions and then respond?
Hi, I'm a professor of journalism in the UK. Actually, it wasn't, I'm coming off of the back of Indra, actually, in terms of how we produce, distribute and exchange information in a new information economy. The reason I asked the question is because I've been here obviously a few days. It's been a great Congress, by the way. My brain is still aching from all the information exchange. But one of the things I've brought up whilst I've been here is it feels like naked marketing every time I raise it. But I'm an old guy, yeah, I'm nearly 60. I would like Indra. I was trained at the BBC in the classic methods of getting out there, using your sources, turning them into great stories, and the BBC has a great reputation. I was there for 30 years as one of the senior on-air reporters, and I believed in what I did, really believed in it. But I recognized that the information space has transformed. My son, who's 24, I never thought he was going to become a journalist. I always thought he was going to be an entrepreneur. Turns out he is an entrepreneur. He set up something called nowherenews.com, Knowhere, news.com. He's British, but he's based in Silicon Valley. He went to Silicon Valley because there's money there to support research into trying to identify ways of changing the unit economics of doing journalism. Journalism's never paid for itself, ever. We might like to think it has, but it's never done it. And that is a fundamental challenge. If the previous speaker said, local doesn't pay, we have to find ways that it does pay if we want to have journalism do the transformative work that it must do. Now, Nathaniel is 24. There are many other 24-year-olds out there doing this work. We need to support them. We need to get them into our universities to speak with our young people, because the reality is our mindset very often is the wrong mindset. We kind of need to encourage those millennial mindsets to think new, to think big, to think out of the box.
Thanks. I think we can all agree on that. Is there anyone else that wanted to pose a question now, or I'll ask for a response? Yeah? But maybe we can respond to Alexandra and her point of like a better, like how do we curate better, I think, you know, or how do we have a data resource, that one we talked about. Yeah.
Hello, this is a question for Indira. I think that I've heard you saying that you advise that students should be first citizens of the world before they start something new. And also prioritizing face-to-face meetups in order to exchange knowledge and also to discover things on their own. So I assume that this is what you are doing in the Jam Lab the past 3 years, and I would like to have more information or feedback how this challenge is going on from your own experience as you try to apply these principles together. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else for now? Okay. Yeah, so Indra, do you want to respond to that? Like what's happening at Jam Lab? And I do love the idea of the journalist citizens is what you called them instead of citizen journalists.
Yeah, so one thing, I'll just give one sort of couple of examples about that. So when we started, I thought, so these aren't journalists, these aren't students. So I do run a course, an entrepreneurship course with students, but these are people, sometimes journalists, sometimes other kinds of media makers who have, you know, proposed some new innovation, and then if they win a place, we have a sort of funneling system, they pitch, we have selection teams and stuff, and then if they win a place, they come onto this program for 6 months where they spend about at least a day and a half, usually a week, with us. So when we started, I think we assumed that most of them, if not all of them, would be proposing new pieces of media, you know, new media platforms or new media content. But in fact, some of the most interesting work has been what we've called repairing innovation. So it's more like some systematic intervention into the media system that's fixing something that's broken. So I can give a couple of examples. And I suppose that relates to my idea of being a sort of system first, like making sure that you understand how our media systems work and then thinking about how we're going to make this work in the future. So one example that's current in our current cohort, a woman started, this is a non-profit, just started at the beginning of the program, and she launched about 2 months ago. She found some data that in South Africa, we had about 17% of people quoted in news media were women. And she wanted to fix that problem. And she tried different models. She had a very clear model at the beginning, which didn't work, and we worked with her, and she adapted it. And then during our election, which was quite recent, she launched this thing. And it's incredibly effective. I mean, she's got tons of feedback from journalists who have started massively increasing the number of women they quote. And then another team who's part of our cohort, who are data journalists, went and did a tracked sort of current practice online, and now they're sort of tracking all the main digital news sources so we can compare and contrast them and give them feedback. And in fact, one of the major media groups came to us just 2 weeks ago and asked, can she come and talk to all their editors? So like, she's already making a difference, fixing a clearly identified broken problem. So that I think is pretty exciting, and I think students could be engaged in those sort of problems, like looking at the system, how do you fix it, how do you innovate, what kind of technology, who are these users? Most of it's not about tech, most of it's really about understanding what is the system, how does a journalist decide who they're going to quote, and at what point are you going to intervene, what will change their mind? So it's been interesting, and it's one of the ones I'm excited about because I think she might, by the end of this year, have made like a measurable, noticeable difference.
We're hot, hey? So unless anybody has any further comments, and we'd love to chat more. I really like the idea that around crowdsourcing an idea. So yeah, Alex, I very much want to crowdsource. So maybe we can also tweet any ideas or crowdsourcing or things that we as knowledge sharers can do. And for sure, if you have an interesting academic study, I'd certainly like to hear about it, because, yeah. So thanks for coming and hearing about our slacking off in Tbilisi. Yeah. Thanks very much.